The Roman Senate threw feasts while the rivers of Gaul ran red with blood. And somewhere between the wine-soaked celebrations and the marble monuments, history decided to remember Julius Caesar as a hero. How convenient. How perfectly Roman. They built temples to honor the man who turned an entire region into an open-air slaughterhouse, who weaponized starvation like it was just another item in his military toolkit, who looked at 368,000 migrating people and saw nothing but an opportunity for a massacre. Between 58 and 50 BCE, Caesar didn't conquer Gaul so much as he systematically erased it, tribe by tribe, village by village, life by life. And the truly grotesque part? He wrote it all down himself, documenting his atrocities with the casual detachment of someone describing a particularly successful hunting trip. The Helvetii learned this lesson first, though they wouldn't live long enough to pass the wisdom along to anyone else. These Celtic people from what we now call Switzerland decided to migrate, to search for new lands where they might build better lives. A peaceful migration, historians call it. 368,000 men, women, children, elderly, infants still nursing at their mothers' breasts, all moving together in one massive column of hope and desperation. Caesar intercepted them at the Battle of Bibracte, and what followed wasn't a battle so much as it was industrialized butchery. When the survivors limped back home to count their dead, only 110,000 remained. Let that number rot in your mind for a moment. Over 250,000 people gone, erased, transformed into corpses and statistics in a single campaign. Most of them weren't warriors. Most of them weren't even armed. They were families carrying their possessions on their backs, elderly couples helping each other walk, children who probably didn't even understand why the Roman soldiers were screaming as they charged. Caesar saw a migration and decided it looked too much like an invasion, and the difference between those two words cost 250,000 people their lives. But if you think that massacre was the worst of it, you haven't been paying attention to how efficiently Rome could transform human beings into fertilizer. The Germanic tribes who crossed the Rhine discovered that Caesar's capacity for calculated slaughter had no bottom, no limit, no line he wouldn't cross if it served his ambition. The Usipetes and Tencteri, driven from their own lands by larger tribes, came to Gaul seeking refuge, seeking mercy, seeking anything except what they actually got. Caesar met them with negotiations, with promises, with envoys and discussions, and all the theater of diplomatic resolution. And while those tribal representatives sat in his camp, discussing terms of surrender and conditions for peace, Caesar was planning their annihilation with the kind of meticulous attention to detail it would make a modern war criminal weep with envy. He timed the attack for dawn, that perfect moment when exhaustion and trust combine to make people vulnerable, when warriors have finally allowed themselves to sleep, believing the talking means the killing has stopped. Roman cavalry fell upon the Germanic encampments like a plague with swords, cutting through tents where families slept, slaughtering warriors, and elders and women and children with the kind of indiscriminate efficiency that reveals the attack as true purpose. Ancient sources claim 430,000 people died in this single operation, though modern scholars debate whether the numbers are accurate or exaggerated. Does it matter? Whether it was 430,000 or 200,000 or even 100,000, Caesar ordered the massacre of an entire people, while their envoys sat in his camp believing they were negotiating peace. The Rhine itself became a river of corpses, so clogged with the dead that the water ran thick and dark. And Caesar documented all of it in his war commentaries with the emotional investment of someone describing crop rotations. The truly stomach-turning detail is that Caesar framed these massacres as military achievements, as necessary actions taken by a responsible commander protecting Roman interests. He turned genocide into resumed building material. When Plutarch and Appian later calculated that Caesar's campaigns killed approximately 1 million people, they weren't condemning him. They were marveling at his efficiency, his military genius, his ability to pacify enormous territories through strategic application of mass murder. Modern scholars bless their cautious academic souls, hedge their language, and question ancient numbers. But even their conservative estimates paint a picture soaked in blood. Gaul's population before Caesar arrived stood somewhere between 3 and 6 million. By the time he finished his campaigns of civilization, between 1/6 and 1/3 of that population had been killed. Not soldiers, not warriors, people. The Gauls who survived called it annihilation. Rome called it conquest. History, with its infinite capacity for selective memory, chose to remember it as greatness. The tribes learned quickly that resistance meant extinction, and submission meant something arguably worse. But we'll get to that horror next, because Caesar's creativity in finding new ways to destroy human lives was just getting started. Hunger turned out to be Caesar's favorite weapon, which makes a twisted kind of sense when you think about it. Swords require effort, require soldiers to look into the eyes of the people they're killing, require some minimal engagement with the reality of ending a life. But starvation? Starvation lets you kill from a distance, lets you transform mass murder into a patient waiting game, lets you tell yourself you're not really the murderer, because technically the victims are dying from lack of food, not from Roman steel. How philosophically convenient. How perfectly sociopathic. When the Great Gallic Revolt erupted in 52 BC under Vercingetorix, a leader who actually had the audacity to unite the tribes against their civilized Roman benefactors, Caesar found himself facing a scorched earth strategy. Vercingetorix burned his own towns, his own crops, his own supplies, denying Caesar the resources his army needed. So Caesar, with the kind of logic that only makes sense to monsters, decided to target the one fortified city Vercingetorix had agreed to defend. Avaricum, known as one of the finest cities in all of Gaul, became Caesar's testing ground for weaponized starvation. The city sat naturally defended by rivers and marshlands with only one narrow entrance, and inside those walls, 40,000 people crowded together, believing stone and water would keep them safe. They were wrong, but they wouldn't realize how wrong until it was far too late to matter. Caesar built his siege works with methodical patience, while Vercingetorix's army camped 15 miles away, harassing Roman supply lines, but unable to break the siege without sacrificing his forces in an unwinnable assault. For 25 days, both armies endured hardship, though the nature of that hardship differed dramatically. Roman soldiers ate meat exclusively, a rarity for legionaries accustomed to grain rations, but still food, still sustenance, still enough to keep bodies functioning and swords swinging. Inside Avaricum, the 40,000 trapped inhabitants slowly discovered what dying from hunger actually feels like. First comes the constant ache in your belly, that gnawing sensation that gradually transforms from discomfort to pain to an all-consuming agony that makes thinking about anything else impossible. Then your body starts consuming itself, burning through fat reserves before moving on to muscle tissue, your own flesh becoming fuel to keep your heart beating just a little longer. Children stopped crying because crying requires energy they no longer possessed. Women watched their infants waste away at their breasts as their bodies stopped producing milk. The elderly simply sat down one day and never stood back up, their bodies having finally calculated that the math no longer worked, that continuing to live required more resources than remaining alive could possibly justify. And through it all, Caesar waited. He could have lifted the siege, could have accepted surrender, could have allowed the inhabitants to evacuate and scatter into the countryside. Instead, he maintained his blockade with the patience of someone who understood that time was his weapon and hunger his ally. When Roman siege towers finally breached the defenses during a rainstorm, the legionaries flooded into the city, carrying weeks of frustration and hunger-induced rage. Caesar's own account, written with his characteristic bloodless prose, records that his troops killed all 40,000 inhabitants. Every single person, men who could barely lift weapons, women too weak to run, children who'd been dying slowly for weeks, the elderly who'd already given up, all of them slaughtered as the rain mixed with blood and turned the streets into rivers of viscous crimson mud. Only 800 people managed to escape, and you have to wonder what kind of nightmares they carried with them. What horrors played behind their eyes every time they closed them to sleep. But at least those 40,000 got to die relatively quickly. The survivors of Caesar's campaigns faced a fate that many ancient peoples considered worse than death itself, because Caesar understood that killing everyone was inefficient when you could profit from their misery instead. 1 million Gauls were sold into slavery during his campaigns, a number so staggering that it represents roughly 1/6 to 1/3 of Gaul's entire population, depending on which population estimates you accept. These weren't prisoners of war captured on battlefields. These were surrendered populations, defeated tribes, people who'd laid down their weapons and begged for mercy and received chains instead. The Veneti, a powerful maritime tribe who made the mistake of losing a naval battle in 56 BCE, watched Caesar execute their entire council of elders before selling the rest of the population into slavery. The Achuatuchi surrendered after a siege, accepting Roman terms, believing submission would save them. All 53,000 survivors were immediately enslaved and sold in a single lot to slave traders who followed. Caesar's army like vultures trailing a dying animal. The economic motivation was deliciously corrupt. Roman generals were supposed to share proceeds from slave sales with the Senate, but Caesar's commentaries conveniently omit any mention of these transactions. By recording in his official reports that prisoners had been killed rather than enslaved, Caesar could pocket the profits himself, enriching his war chest while keeping the Senate ignorant of his financial crimes. This money funded his campaigns while ensuring his soldiers' loyalty through generous bonuses paid in coins minted from Gallic suffering. The dispersal of enslaved Gauls throughout the Roman Empire served a purpose beyond profit, though. By scattering defeated tribes across the Mediterranean world, Caesar ensured they could never reunite, never return to their ancestral lands, never rebuild what he destroyed. Entire communities were torn apart, families separated at auction blocks, children sold away from parents, wives ripped from husbands. Their languages died on their tongues as they were forbidden to speak anything but Latin. Their traditions vanished as they were forced to adopt Roman customs. Their gods were forgotten as they were compelled to worship Roman deities. For the Gauls, enslavement meant not just loss of freedom, but the systematic obliteration of everything that had made them who they were. Their entire cultural identity erased as efficiently as Caesar had erased their lives. And Rome celebrated this. They threw feasts and games, built monuments and temples, composed poetry praising Caesar as genius while the enslaved, Gauls who served their wine and cleaned their floors and satisfied their perverse appetites, stood silent, their dead eyes the only testimony to the truth that Rome refused to acknowledge. History remembers Caesar as a great man. Perhaps at S time we remembered exactly what kind of greatness requires a foundation built for 1 million broken lives.